The story of Father Mazzuchelli is really the story of Catholicism coming to America. And we see these missionaries from Europe inflamed with a holy zeal for the gospel, coming to what was a wild place to proclaim the gospel to people that they had never met, to people who had never heard of Jesus or certainly of the Catholic faith.
From its birth at Pentecost through the present day, the Church has been constructed and sustained by men and women offering themselves as living stones to spread the gospel of Jesus Christ and be witnesses to the love of God, actively working within their hearts. Countless saints throughout history have laid down their personal desires, hopes, dreams, and even their lives to take up the cross, follow Christ, and make disciples. In the middle of the 19th century, Samuel Mazzuchelli, a young Italian Dominican friar, answered the Holy Spirit's call to spread the message of the gospel in America.
Well, Samuel Charles Mazzuchelli was born on November 4th, 1806, in Milan, Italy. His family lived in the shadow of the great Duomo, the great cathedral of Milan. And so he knew beauty when it came to the church. Lived quite literally in the shadow of beauty. Now, his mother died when he was young, and because of that, his father sent him off to a boarding school up in Switzerland. So, beginning at age 6 for his education, he was trained up there. Sometime during his education, we believe that Mazzuchelli became aware of the Dominicans. What's interesting, though, is we're not sure exactly how that would have come about or where he would have heard of them. So we can chalk it up to the inspiration of the Holy Spirit as to how he became a Dominican.
Samuel's father was a practical man and questioned why his son would choose to join a struggling religious order in the wake of the French Revolution led by the merciless Napoleon Bonaparte. He knew these were dark and difficult times for the church in Europe. Ultimately, he was supportive of his son and God's plan for his life. And as Samuel began religious life, he asked his son for a special favor.
His father wrote to him asking that a portrait be painted so that he'd have some remembrance of his son. Perhaps he knew through some sort of divine inspiration that his son would be taken far away. When Mazzuchelli talks about the portrait, he says it looks pretty close to how he is, although he's a bit thinner and with a bit more color because the summer sun was nice that year. He was concerned mainly about the price of the portrait. This was a very expensive undertaking because the artists in Rome demanded a high price, but nevertheless that portrait was painted and was given to his father as a gift of remembrance.
We think of this young Father Mazzuchelli in Milan, Italy, growing up in a completely different culture and environment than what he encountered here. But clearly at a very young age, he listened to the Holy Spirit and discerned his vocational call.
The Bishop Edward Dominic Fenwick, the first bishop of the Diocese of Cincinnati, himself an American Dominican, journeyed to Europe to try and drum up support and interest in serving in missionary territory. And in his presentation, he called the Diocese of Cincinnati the largest and poorest diocese in the world. A few years later, in 1828, Samuel answers the call and travels to the New World to follow Bishop Fenwick in serving as a missionary apostolic here in the United States. He writes poetically in his memoirs about the harrowing trip across the sea that took weeks.
As it happened, the joy of the travelers was short-lived. A northwestern gale began to howl. The waves rose threateningly, and the ship was forced to rise and plunge with the turbulent foaming waters. The rig could barely withstand the fury of the wind, clinging to the mainmast. He could see the violent, imperious waves venting their wrath upon the ship, often as if trying to engulf it, flooding the entire deck with their crests, but conquered by man's intelligence, breaking and receding. The dark and thundering sky denied even the slightest ray of hope to watchful voyagers.
Landing in New York, knowing no English and having no clue where he was supposed to be going to get to Cincinnati, but through the generosity and the aid and friendship of many in New York, was eventually able to make his way to Cincinnati. He would finish his formation as a Dominican at St. Rose Priory in Kentucky, and then was ordained by Bishop Fenwick in 1830 in Cincinnati, and was sent to Michigan as his first assignment, being one of 2 priests at the time in the Great Northwest Territory.
Father Mazzuchelli made his way to Mackinac Island and began ministering to neglected Catholics who needed to be re-evangelized in their faith, as well as to non-Catholics. However, as a young Catholic priest, he was not welcomed by all.
Being the new guy in town, the Protestant pastor on the island, Pastor Ferry, was not too happy with his presence. Mazzuchelli, though, being a man of learning and a man of evangelization, wasn't going to enter into this battle with Ferry. So what he ended up doing was he'd go and attend Ferry's services, sitting in the back and taking notes on the sermons which were staunchly anti-Catholic against this new and young priest who had arrived. And the following week, Mazzuchelli would preach a rebuttal, focusing on the goodness and the truth of the faith, focusing not on attacking directly, but rather through education, coming to evangelize. And he was effective.
I think today we either ignore or attack often, and Father Mazzuchelli did neither. He engaged, he responded, but always with the love of Christ. It reminds me of Francis de Sales, who lived at a time of violent conflict between Protestants and Catholics, and he would engage in these epic dialogues and debates with Protestant leaders, and he'd always win the day, both with his truth but also with his remarkable charity and gentleness.
There were many conversions there on the island, Protestants who found the truth in the Catholic faith and decided to follow Mazzuchelli into it.
Father Mazzuchelli recounts this in his memoirs.
The solemnity of Christ's resurrection, therefore, was celebrated in 1831, together with the spiritual resurrection of a small group of Protestants who, animated by the faith, renounced all error, publicly and forever, to range themselves under the standard of the cross, to bind them in still closer union with their heavenly Redeemer. They received that mystical bread of angels, which gives life eternal. It is true that the Calvinist minister, after his studied attack on Catholic doctrine, did not have the consolation of adding to the number of his followers, while humanly speaking, the religious controversy which he aroused was the indirect cause of several conversions of Protestants, and helped to make the faith clearer and better known to many who had known it imperfectly.
In time, he would move down to Green Bay and build the first church in the Green Bay area. This was his first foray into church architecture. What's fascinating is that he had no formal education in church architecture and architecture at all, and yet he would spend much of his years in the United States designing and building church buildings.
Father Mazzuchelli describes St. John the Evangelist Catholic Church in Green Bay, Wisconsin.
After many journeys, much fatigue, anxiety, and expense, came the consolation of seeing the Church of St. John the Evangelist raised as far as the roof. To form an idea of the Church of Green Bay, imagine a stone foundation sunk somewhat into the earth and rising about 3 feet above the ground. Upon this wall are laid oak beams. At first sight, what they call the frame of the house looks like a cage. This is then overlaid on the outside with planks about 6 inches wide and ½ an inch thick. The walls of the church are built in this way to make their interior weatherproof. The roof is also entirely of wood. Above the center of the building is a bell tower made in the same way and connected with the walls, from which it rises to a moderate height to withstand all windstorms. Such a church, when built of good timber and protected from the weather, may last for centuries.
Father Mazzuchelli worked with the Menominee and Winnebago tribes to complete St. John the Evangelist by the end of 1832. However, Father Mazzuchelli was not only concerned with the construction of church buildings. He cared deeply about each person's spiritual well-being and sought to learn from them as he ministered.
As he interacted with the native peoples, Samuel realized that they too would need forms of prayer that would make sense to them. He translated into their own language a book of prayers, simple prayers and responses for Mass, as one of the first books printed in Wisconsin. He would refer to God as the Great Spirit, a name that was familiar to them, but not letting go of the importance of what the faith teaches. There was a bit of a trade-off. He learned from them the ways of the new frontiers, had many adventures. He writes about his first time on horseback, which after a few hours riding a horse put him in bed for 2 days because of how sore he was. He writes eloquently about his first journey on snowshoes, crossing the Mackinac Strait, amazed at the ability to walk over snow with these wide webs attached to his feet. He writes about the native peoples trapping and killing a bear that was crossing the Wisconsin River, and how he was tickled by the fact that they were eating dinner of what was just this great beast crossing the river a few hours before. So he learned a lot of the adventurous ways of the new frontiers from the native peoples, and in return he gave them right worship and religion, something that would be familiar to them in their own language, traveling from village to village and tribe to tribe, spending time with them in their own tents and wigwams, celebrating Mass on the top of altars built of bark. Very simple means, but dignified in their own way.
After a few years, Father Mazzuchelli made his way down the Wisconsin River to the tri-state area of eastern Iowa, northwestern Illinois, and southwestern Wisconsin, continuing to build the church, both physically and spiritually.
What's amazing is that wherever he was, whether it was with native peoples or up on Mackinac Island or in the town of Galena, he was known to be a man of the people. He realized that things were different here in the new frontier. And it took a village, quite literally, to make things work. When he moved into the Galena area and interacted with the Irish lead miners, they called him Father Mazzuchelli, trading his Italian name for a proper Irish one, denoting that he truly had become part of the people. But Mazzuchelli, or Father Mazzuchelli, realized that he had work to do among them as well, and it wasn't just in the sacraments. He came to realize that many of them had issues with alcohol, and began a temperance society, himself being the leader. He committed to teetotalism, and encouraged them to do so as well, knowing that they needed to leave behind this vice if they were truly to embrace good living. It's just one of many examples of him going the extra mile, realizing that it wasn't enough to just serve the sacraments. It wasn't enough to just be the priest, but really had to engage these people's lives if he was going to have an impact.
In 1843, Bishop Matthias Loris requested that Father Mazzuchelli accompany him to the 5th Provincial Council of Baltimore. The bishop suggested to Father Samuel that after the council meetings were concluded, that he return home to Italy to rest and fundraise for the needy Diocese of Dubuque.
During his trip home, he spent a few years there. He wrote his memoirs, a wealth of stories, which he actually left himself out of. It's called Diary of a Frontier Missionary Priest. He always refers to himself as the missionary. When he returned to the United States after a few years in Italy, he settled in Benton, Wisconsin, and there he founded the congregation of the Cincinnati Dominican Sisters, not too far away in Cincinnati. He opened an academy, which originally was supposed to be a seminary, a school of theology for a new province of Dominican friars. But after the first friars came and realized how harsh and difficult life in the frontier was, they returned or left. Instead of being discouraged by this fact, instead of dropping everything, Mazzuchelli just shifted gears and realized that there was a need for a girls' academy, and so he opened St. Clara Academy for Girls in Benton, Wisconsin. In its day, it rivaled the University of Wisconsin in its offerings, its technology, and its scope of education. He also built St. Patrick's Church in Benton, one of the largest churches that he built and still being used today. Mazzuchelli's final years in Benton were a bit quiet, but active nonetheless, traveling around the parishes that he had founded in the Benton area, the southwest Wisconsin area, but also serving the community there. On a very, very cold mid-February morning, he was called out on a sick call to go anoint a man as he died. He would contract pneumonia during that trip, pneumonia which would in time take his life. He died on February 23rd, 1864, in his small rectory there in Benton. There were a few things with him when he died. One was his cherished image of the sorrowful mother, a mother to whom he related so well in his harsh and difficult conditions in the New World. He died with the words of Psalm 84 on his lips. How lovely is your dwelling place, O Lord of hosts! My soul is longing and yearning for the courts of the Lord. My heart and my flesh cry out to the living God. How lovely is your dwelling place, O Lord of hosts! It's interesting that this would be his favorite psalm, given the work that he did in building so many churches, providing a dignified place for the peoples of the New World to celebrate their faith. Unbeknownst to everyone until after his death, Father Samuel also wore a penance chain around his waist, a penance chain which would have fit well at some point in his life, but by the time he had died had become embedded into his flesh. Nobody knew about this chain, in fact. It was his own quiet form of penance. The chain, being a first-class relic today, has become a source of inspiration and intercession for so many.
Father Mazzuchelli's priestly ministry and Christian witness still resonate today throughout the Midwest, especially within the Diocese of Madison, Wisconsin.
The legacy of Father Mazzuchelli is still very much alive here in the Diocese of Madison. He built churches, confident that the Lord would bless those efforts and bring about a bright and fruitful future. We think of the schools that he founded, the Italian Dominicans, who were a powerhouse in education and in service of the church and of the common good. So his legacy is simply the fact that the church here is flourishing. And when he came here, it was just sparsely settled, a few immigrants who were Catholic.
The seeds of faith planted by Father Mazzuchelli have grown. Presently, the Diocese of Madison, founded by Pope Pius XII in January of 1946, serves over 160,000 Catholics across 8,000 square miles in south-central Wisconsin. Certainly, Father Mazzuchelli would marvel at the growth of the church in this area. However, the great and difficult work of evangelization still remains.
We live in a world today of such fear, violence, conflict, division, a world that radically needs the gospel of Christ. Father Mazzuchelli lived in a very different world, sociologically, religiously, in every other way. But human nature hasn't changed. So human nature is always longing for God. Human nature is always divided and broken because of sin. But ultimately, our hearts are restless until they rest in the Lord. And Father Mazzuchelli, as all saints do, show us the way to find consolation, strength, and peace in Jesus Christ alone.
Many Dominicans have been inspired by Father Mazzuchelli's apostolic zeal and seek his intercession as they live, work, and minister.
Father Samuel's image, his vision, his preaching ministry has just been a part of the fabric of my life as a sister. And I think it happens in all of us in different ways. But it's no accident that Father Samuel became a Dominican. Preaching the gospel, the role of evangelization, is the whole mission of the order and has been for over 800 years. And that's part of what we try to instill in the people we minister with. That whether we evangelize as teachers, nurses, social workers, lawyers, hospital chaplains, hospice workers, social workers, advocates for justice, whatever it is any of our sisters do, we do with the overall umbrella, the mission of the order, and it was Father Samuel's mission to preach and teach the gospel.
He definitely was more than a man of his own time. He was a visionary. He was avant-garde in many of his ways of looking at Dominican life and the gospel, encountering various kinds of people. And you've heard the stories about him being among the people, like St. Dominic, always in the midst of the people. And yet when I was starting to think about, well, what are some of the qualities that Samuel Mazzuchelli had that we could relate to in our own lives? I know when I thought of my own life, there was an attitude in our house about, well, if somebody's in need, you help them out. There was a real sense of hospitality. So I started thinking about the word hospitality. And at first we think of it as, oh, come on in, sit down, have a cup of coffee, here's some cookies, etc., etc. But hospitality, it's a person who welcomes and provides that fundamental interaction that transcends cultural boundaries. And I think that's what Samuel Mazzuchelli was all about.
I was named the vocations director for my province of Dominicans, a ministry which puts me on the road. So I find myself praying with him as I travel. I find myself taking inspiration from him and his adventurous spirit when I'm faced with another difficult day. What's amazing is how often I find myself in his own territory, celebrating Mass in one of his churches, visiting his grave as I pass by, or serving the people that are the descendants of those that he himself served. What a blessing to be so close to a patron. What a blessing to be so inspired by such a great witness to the gospel.
The Diocese of Madison is committed to preserving, promoting, and passing on the legacy of Father Mazzuchelli to a new generation. One way they do this is through an annual pilgrimage.
Every year, our vocations office here in the diocese sponsors a Mazzuchelli pilgrimage, leaving from Dubuque, Iowa, where Father had ministered as well, walking for several days, ultimately to Benton, Wisconsin, where Father Mazzuchelli is buried. The pilgrimage in honor of Father Mazzuchelli both draws our sight towards heaven, towards the promise of salvation, but also reminds us of the pilgrimage that Father Mazzuchelli made from Italy to here, inspired by zeal for the gospel, fueled by sacrifice. And really, you can't walk a 50-mile pilgrimage if you don't have zeal and if you don't have sacrifice. So it really inflames our hearts with those same virtues that fueled Father in his missionary approach and in his really spiritual fruitfulness. Anyone can go on the pilgrimage, but clearly pilgrimages are for the young, at least the young of heart. But I think many of our young people are inspired by what they would perceive to be a challenge. So whether it's the challenge of religious life, challenge of priesthood, challenge of living the gospel, or the challenge of walking for several days. So to lift our sights and to present something that's difficult, but also fulfilling, is something that feeds the hearts and minds and souls of young people. So we don't want to make it easy. We don't want to water it down. We don't want to settle for the mediocre. We want to reach for the heights. And really, that's what Father Mazzuchelli teaches us.
Pilgrims were inspired by Father Samuel's example of missionary discipleship as they walked the 5th annual Father Mazzuchelli pilgrimage from Dubuque to Benton.
I mean, he grew up in Italy, in Milan, but he didn't stay there. And he did come here and he walked this ground. And just that is so cool to me. And also just the fact that I feel like he's got this interior life of goodness and like order that really inspires me, because he was out in the middle of nowhere. Like, he walked when there were no cornfields and restaurants and things and streets, and nobody was there to like make sure he did the right thing. without people watching him. He chose sanctity. And I think that's so powerful in my own life, because oftentimes I feel like I choose to do things well because of other people watching me, like because people would say bad things about me if I didn't do the right thing, or, I feel like there's some peer pressure forcing me to do like what is good. And I think it's so impactful to be like, no, like I should do it because it is good and because I love God.
He is a model of trust and faith in that he followed what God was calling him to do. And he came blindly to an area he didn't know. And so many things could have shut him down and stopped him from spreading the gospel and spreading his faith. But he kept going. He made churches and he evangelized. And it's just kind of gives me hope that things will be hard, but to just not give up on your faith and your values.
We are living in a world where we are all called to be missionary disciples to those around us. And that I think Father Samuel Mazzuchelli had this great witness to missionary zeal that we all need to also have in our hearts if we are to really spread the word of the gospel here in our culture and our society, and really try to bring Christ's love first and foremost to each and every person we encounter. And I think Father Mazzuchelli had great dedication in doing that and great zeal.
It is evident that over a century later, Father Samuel Mazzuchelli serves as a role model of Christian witness, evangelization, and as an intercessor for those seeking to spread the saving message of Christ in our rapidly evolving cultural landscape today.
We're engaged in a bold strategic replanning of the diocese. We're not closing churches, but we're reframing parishes so that priests can work as teams, that we can better utilize our resources, unify our staffs, and be more effective in mission. It is reflective of the imagination of Father Mazzuchelli, because Father Mazzuchelli built churches where they were needed, but he was always on the move. So there's nothing static about him. And sometimes we can become so much focused on the maintenance of what we've received institutionally that trumps the mission. How do we make the structure serve the mission? So we're not closing the churches, for example, that Father Mazzuchelli began, but we're restructuring how we live the gospel because of a radically changed demographic and world that we live in today from where he was in his vantage point. He's buried here. He's really our saint to be, and I'm very blessed to serve in the same physical place where he planted those first seeds of the gospel.
Let us wake up then, open our eyes in apostolic charity, and, if we are called, set out for any place where the work is great and difficult.